Okay, the endocrine system, this is the first of two videos on the endocrine system. Okay, so when we're talking about the endocrine system, we need to know what the function is. And basically what it does is it helps out in areas that the nervous system cannot accomplish. So we know that the nervous system is pretty responsible for homeostasis. And if you remember, the hypothalamus was the part that had to do with controlling like maybe your temperature, the blood pH, and areas like that. Well, the endocrine system has glands that produce products, and these products are called hormones. And the hormones help to affect a change in your systems. So what's a hormone? It's a chemical that's released in one part of the body. It travels through the bloodstream, and then it will affect the cells in other parts of the body. So for example, we could look at the pancreas produces insulin, and the insulin travels through the bloodstream, but it affects the cells in the liver, because remember, the liver is the organ that accomplishes the storage of glucose. It turns the glucose into glycogen and then breaks the glycogen down back into glucose if glucagon is present. So the way that hormones work, if you remember enzymes, they're kind of similar to that, but not quite. Hormones are specific to certain cells, and those cells are called target cells. And these target cells have to have receptors on them that fit a particular hormone. And if it doesn't have the receptors on it, well, then the hormone will not have an effect on it. So the other part that's included in this endocrine system would be glands. And a gland is an organ that releases a secretion. So in the excretory system, we looked at exocrine glands. Like your sweat comes out of sweat glands would be an example. But the sweat that comes out immediately affects your skin, because that's where the glands are. Well, endocrine glands are a little bit different, because when they secrete their hormones, these go directly into the bloodstream and then affect other organs. So you will have to know this diagram right here that I have, and be able to identify what glands are located where. So the hypothalamus has hormones that control the pituitary gland. In addition, the hypothalamus makes hormones that are stored in the pituitary gland. And that pituitary gland is right behind the hypothalamus, and it produces hormones that regulate other glands. Going down on the diagram, we have the parathyroid glands. You guys know where your thyroid is. And the parathyroid glands release a hormone which regulates calcium. The thymus is like in the middle of your chest, and it releases thymosin, and it stimulates T cell development. And remember, T cells have a little bit to do with your immune system, and so it helps to develop the proper immune response. Your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys, and this has to do with your fight or flight response. And then the testes produce the hormones that are necessary for male secondary sex characteristics. That's also responsible for sperm production. And then you have the ovaries, which produce estrogen and progesterone, which have to do with females' characteristics. As I said earlier, the pancreas produces insulin and glucagon, and that deals with the glucose or the blood glucose. And let's go back up. Inside or in between the parathyroid glands, you have your thyroid, and it produces thyroxine, which deals with your metabolism. If you remember, metabolism is the summation of all the chemical reactions that happen in your body. Now, up in the brain behind that pituitary gland is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland's kind of cool, and it contains my favorite hormone, which is melatonin. And melatonin helps to regulate your body's cycles, in particular your sleep-wake cycles. So when melatonin is present, that's when you would be sleepy. And it's usually, if you're in the sun, melatonin will not be produced. But when the sun goes down at certain times of the day, then melatonin is produced, and then you get sleepy, and then you go to sleep. So when we talk about hormones, there are two types. You have steroid hormones and non-steroid hormones. The steroid hormones are made of lipids. In particular, they are made of cholesterol. This is a good kind of cholesterol. And then the non-steroid hormones include proteins. Now, you've learned by now that if you see the word peptide or amino acid, immediately your mind should go to the word protein. So with the steroid type hormones, these are different from the non-steroid ones in that they can go across the cell membrane. Okay, they can cross the cell membrane easily. So if you look at this diagram here, the steroid hormone is on the outside, and where's the receptor? The receptor's on the inside. So what happens is this steroid hormone goes across that cell membrane, okay, and then it will bind to a receptor, and it forms what's called the hormone receptor complex. That's the HRC. Then that HRC will enter the nucleus, and it binds to the DNA. It binds to what's called a DNA control sequence, and this binding initiates transcription of genes to mRNA. So remember a gene is a piece of DNA, and then transcription is what makes the RNA. And then what's going to happen with this RNA? It guides the making of what? That's right, proteins. So that messenger RNA will move into the cytoplasm and direct protein synthesis. Now the deal is, since you've got this different gene in the DNA, so now you're going to have a different messenger RNA. If you have a different messenger RNA, you also have a different protein. And if your proteins are different, that's going to change the functions that happen in the cell. Because remember, the proteins are responsible for the phenotype, or what the cell does, right? So in summation of that, what regulates the gene expression? That's right, the hormone receptor complex. So as soon as that hormone goes through the cell, it attaches to the receptor, bam. Now you've got different DNA that's going to be made, and in turn it's going to be different proteins. So these different proteins will produce dramatic changes in the cell, and if they have dramatic changes in the cell, they're going to have big changes in what the organism does. And so the organism we're talking about would be your body. So here's some examples of steroid hormones. And I've put on here kind of a way for you to kind of know what they deal with. So glucocorticoids are with your immune system. Mineralocorticoids have something to do with your salt and water balance. So they probably act on what organ do you think? That's right, your kidneys. Androgens, if you remember the prefix andro, do you remember what that was from? Okay, andro was from, the root word meant male. Estrogens have to do our female hormones. Okay. Progestogens are female also. I'll make the little female sign, how's that? And that's the male sign. There you go. And then vitamin D. And see what vitamin D does? Now your body makes vitamin D, and it only makes it if you go in the sun. And they found that nowadays with more people worried about skin cancer, and they're not in the sun like they used to be, so they're finding that a lot of people have low levels of vitamin D and have to take supplements as opposed to just getting it naturally. Okay, we had the steroid hormones, which could pass through the cell membrane. Now we have the non-steroid hormones, which do not go into the cell, or they do not pass the cell membrane. So if you look at this one, if you remember, on the steroid hormone, the receptor was on the inside of the cell. This time, it's right on the cell membrane. So that non-steroid hormone will bind to the receptor on the cell membrane, and then what happens is an enzyme is activated, and it makes what's called a secondary messenger. So instead of the hormone being the messenger like it was in the steroid hormone type, in the non-steroid or the protein hormones, there's what's called a second messenger, and it carries the message inside the cell. And that messenger will activate and inhibit cell activity. So it could start some things or it might stop some things. So that's the enzyme activities are what alter the cellular function. Whereas in the previous one, it was a hormone receptor complex that altered the cell function. You might want to rewind the tape and look at the animation on the side there so you can kind of see how things are happening. Here's some examples of non-steroid hormones. You have epinephrine, which is the same as adrenaline. You have insulin, serotonin, and dopamine. If you remember neurotransmitters, that was from our nervous system, and it transferred the impulse from one axon to the other. And then serotonin is the hormone that gives you the good feelings. Here's a video that you were able to watch that talks about the endocrine system. It's about 2-3 minutes long. Okay. Cells that have receptors for a particular hormone are called, that's right, target cells. Chemicals that travel through the bloodstream and affect the activities of other cells, that's right, hormones. Melatonin, remember I told you that's my favorite hormone. It's involved in rhythmic activities such as sleep-wake cycles. And what gland was it in? That's right, the pineal gland. And which group of hormones act on target cells by binding directly to the DNA? That's right, the steroid hormones. And then this last one I went ahead and gave you the answer for, but its metabolism is maintained by feedback loops. If you remember our negative feedback loops, as far as metabolism, now metabolism, right? Hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and the thyroid gland. And that's the end of part 1 of the endocrine system. Oops. Go back and let's see. Discard.